Is everybody comfortable with the temperature the way it is? I can make it a degree colder or a degree warmer. Frank, you want it hotter? Oh, that's good. Okay. Let's begin with the word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, we thank you that we can come together in your name to learn more about you, to learn more about each other. And as we find strength in each other, help us to then collectively take that strength out into the world to help the world. So guide us and bless us in our study today as we look at ancient times to seek to discover if there's any way that that influenced our faith today. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay. Anybody, I talked last week or week before about Bibles. If anybody wants the Lutheran Study Bible in paperback, it's $20. In large print, it's $49. Just let my noble, loyal wife, I was about to say secretary. Oh, that would be bad, wouldn't it? Just let Peg know, and we'll get those ordered soon. Okay. We're going to look today at an introduction of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their relation to Jesus' ministry. I was tempted when I chose this subject to just jump into how it relates to Jesus' ministry. And I got to thinking, I'll bet a lot of these people have never seen Dead Sea Scrolls, don't know where they came from, hear all this talk about it and all that. And so I tried to sort it out over the past 2-3 weeks. And like I told Peg, you open one door and there's 3 more doors in front of you. And they're all right, according to them. Now you got to choose which one you're going to take. You take that one, and it's going to open a couple more. And it just goes on and on. It reaches a point where you say, when you're putting something like this together, where do I stop? And I stopped today about 1 o'clock and said, that's far enough. Now, you didn't have outlines tonight because on the outline, when there's a picture, if you remember, on a picture on an outline, it takes up about that much space on a sheet of paper. Well, you're going to see lots of pictures tonight. So I'll trust that you can get along without an outline. Next week, there will be outlines on the final chapters of the book of Revelation. Okay. This is kind of the countryside, the way it looks down by the Dead Sea, where the Qumran community is located. And I will block out the passenger train going through there. But that gives you a little bit idea what a barren place it is. It is a very barren place. Now, there are various theories of how the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Some say, and this is the one that's most used, that shepherds throwing stones into a cave while they were grazing their sheep heard the sound of breaking pottery. They didn't do anything about it that day. Here's another theory. Did a dog fall into a hole? And they went back looking for it. Or some other tale of speculation. The top one is the one most used. This much we know. There were 3 cousins who were Bedouin shepherds out in that territory. And you can see how scrawny it is where the sheep have a little bit to eat. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest group of Old Testament manuscripts ever found so far. It precedes any Jewish manuscripts used to put the Jewish Old Testament together that have any credibility by at least 1,000 years. It's that much older. They were discovered in 1946 or 47. We get some crucial points here about the date, and you'll see it in just a minute. But in the 8 years up to 1955, those Bedouin had gone back and discovered 9 more caves. Now, I didn't have time to go into all the details on why they go back looking for more caves, because they realized that somebody got $250,000 in their pocket to get the first 4 scrolls. Actually, there were 7, and they bought 4 to go with 3, and they made 7. Is that math okay? Okay. The contents. As I say, at least 1,000 years older than traditional Hebrew texts that are used as the basis of modern translations. Most of those texts agree with our translations today. Some agree with the Greek Septuagint. The Greek Septuagint is the Old Testament not in Hebrew, but in Greek. And so that's the way that one works. Okay, here's some contents. The total number of scrolls, when they are intact, almost reach 1,000. It's 930, 940, something like that. That's when they would be intact. Now, you'll see how they get to that point in a moment. Scholars have identified remains of at least 900 different scrolls. Most are bits and pieces, as you can imagine, being that old. One cave, cave number 4, contained an estimated 15,000 fragments. Another author says 17,000 fragments. So you can imagine going in. They found some in pottery. They found some strewn on the floor. You'll see when I show you pictures of the scrolls. You know, worms could have eaten through a scroll. All kinds of things could have happened. Biblically, Denise, I'm going to try to hold questions till the very end, but go ahead.
I just wanted to know what language. I was curious to know what language they were written in.
You'll hear that in just a moment. Out of those 930 scrolls or so, about 1/4 of them are biblical. Straight biblical as we know it. Others interpret some stuff of the Bible. They're called apocryphones. But biblically, in the Old Testament, there are how many books? 39. Dead Sea Scrolls contain 38 of them, or partially some of them. But some, like we've got a couple complete copies of Isaiah, and there are others. But they contain all the Old Testament books except Esther. And there are scholars that just spend their time speculating why Esther's not included. It's not a long book. It talks about the festival of Purim, P-U-R-I-M. But nowhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls is Purim ever mentioned. So that could be why it's left out. Or just, as I was reading this morning, one of the scholars says, well, maybe this just got overlooked. That's a cop-out, but that's all right. Non-biblically, you have rules of the community, and the rules of the community go on and on and on and on. There's also a war scroll, which is one of the first 7, what to do in times of war. And the copper scroll is unique unto itself. It's the only one of all that they have found that is not papyrus or parchment. It's copper. It's a single one other. And you can imagine they've tried all kinds of things. What they've tried, Michael, is they've some new kind of infrared light to be able to see through, and because they know if they try to unroll it, it's just going to be brittle and break off. You have enough of that problem with the papyrus and parchment ones, especially papyrus. So here are the original 7. When they were discovered by the Bedouins, they were sold off in 2 lots. Now that discovery was announced on April 11th, 1948. Who knows the significance of that date? That's the day when Israel came into being through a United Nations statement. And so it was on that date that they released them, and that will affect them here in a minute. So the original scrolls included 7, the Manual of Discipline, the Tale of the Patriarchs. The patriarchs don't get a lot of space in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that was a book. Thanksgiving hymns, Psalms. The number of Psalms vary, but they have found now what they believe is the 151st Psalm. That's interesting. Commentary on Habakkuk, Old Testament prophet, the War Scrolls, and 2 copies of the book of Isaiah. We'll talk about why that's important. Did I do something bad? What did I do, Al? You don't know, huh? Well, we'll go back and look. There we go. Okay. Where were they found? They were found in the Dead Sea, and I'll point out geographically in a little bit where that is. It was home to the Qumran community. The Qumran community will just say at this point we're a group of Essenes, and we'll show how they differ from other Jews at that time. Now that's also home to Masada, which you've probably heard a lot about. Masada was Herod's Camp David. When Herod wanted to get away from Jerusalem and have a weekend, he had this town, quote, built, mighty fortress at Masada. And so you see that the purposes, there may be connection, but presently that would take a lot of speculation. They're about 40 miles apart. I'll show you on a map in a minute. And so you see their purposes were entirely different. Masada's purpose was to protect King Herod. Qumran's purpose was to develop a religious community. Here it are. I hope you can see this.
Which Herod are you talking about?
Which
Herod the Great?
You weren't supposed to ask me that. Yeah, you wouldn't be talking about, you'd be talking about Herod the Great, who's the first. Okay, the little square up here is Qumran. And I'll show you pictures of the community in a minute. They found 11 caves. Ultimately, that's where we stand today. They're still looking. 4 through 10 are just southwest of Qumran. 3 and 11. Now 11 becomes one of the more important ones, but not as important as Cave 4. You can come down here. Also manuscripts were found in Wadi Maruba, down in there, all the way down here's Masaba. So it's about roughly, as you can see here, 40 miles from one to the other. And I'll come back to that picture in a minute. Here's a picture of the Dead Sea. How many have seen the Dead Sea? Did it look like this in spots? At high tide, maybe. But this is to show you that's really when it's at a low point to show the salt formations within it. Here's how the Qumran site may have looked before excavation began. It was inhabited sometime around, we say around 175 BC. But more and more they're saying like 150 BC. And it lasted until AD 68. We know that. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Probably inhabited by an Essene community, which is a group, a Hebrew group of believers. And the question always comes up, was John the Baptist an Essene? And you'll just hang with me as we try to unravel this whole thing. If we say John the Baptist was an Essene, there gives you a Jesus connection to the Essene community. Don't jump on that bandwagon yet. There's maybe how it looked when they discovered it. There were nearby caves. They may have been used by the Qumran community when the Romans began their destruction up the Jordan in, did I say AD? Yeah, AD 68. AD 68. So that's why we know, well, let me put a few other things up here. The community probably heard of other destruction in other nearby cities in 66 or 67 AD. The coinage that has been discovered at Qumran backs up that view. Josephus tells us of the destruction of Jericho in AD 68. Either in hearing or knowing of that destruction, the Essenes probably began to hide their library. Now, how does coinage back that up? When archaeologically it's cleared out, and you know the tools of archaeology are a little paintbrush at best, and you clean out this whole thing, as you'll see in a minute. They found coins, and they found a fair number of coins from 66 AD. They found a lot fewer from 67 AD, and they didn't find any from 68 AD. So that's why it becomes fairly clear that that's when the Qumran community was overrun by the Romans as they went up the Jordan River. Here's a picture of the countryside. The closest we get to it in our country, if any of you are aware of it, is Tufa Rock. Tufa Rock, Tufa Stone. Anybody from Northwest Ohio here know what Tufa Rock is? But you can see there are caves. There are caves up high. There are different shaped caves throughout that particular area. Just gives you another view of a cave from the inside looking out. See, it has some size to it. Now, inside those caves, over the years that they were discovered, which actually run about 8-9 years, some intact pottery was found, over 900 manuscripts discovered. Many were written in Hebrew and Greek, the overwhelming number in Hebrew. And there is a scriptorium at the Qumran site that we'll point out to you later. It's where they probably did the copying. You know, they didn't have Xerox machines in those days. You didn't just put your Sunday crossword puzzle on there and your wife makes you a copy. But about 13% of those were written in Aramaic. Now, what makes that an interesting fact is that today many scholars are now starting to ask, what do those Aramaic scrolls say? Naturally, the first ones that were discovered in Hebrew, the Old Testament scholars would be the ones who would dive in and look at it. And because they were such Hebrew scholars, they just kind of push aside the Aramaic and dig into the big pile. I mean, that's human nature. But now that they're starting to look at the Aramaic ones in a little more depth, we're learning a little bit, and there's more to come. There'll be more to come. This is where, if they're in Aramaic, we could continue the connection with Jesus. That's the language that Jesus spoke. Not all of the 900 manuscripts came from the writings of the Qumran community. Some of them are 100 years older than that they evidently got somewhere and brought into Qumran, into their library. Some can be dated from the 3rd century. And I'll tell you how they date in just a minute. Went back here just to show you the various caves. Their locations are all within roughly 2 to 3 miles of Qumran. And you see where Jericho is located and Jerusalem. So they're not far from those two important places. Give you an example of a connection. There's a scroll called the Apocryphon of Daniel. And I'll explain what those numbers are in just a minute. It's written in Aramaic, at least 100 years before the Gospel of Luke was written. And it says, quote, "A future ruler will be called Great, and by his name he will be designated. The Son of God he will be proclaimed, and the Son of the Most High they will call him." Now, what does Luke say? In Luke, the angel appears to Mary and says that her son will be called the Son of the Most High and the Son of God. You see a very close connection between the two. There are many others. Identifying the scrolls, once a fragment. Now, we could be talking about a piece about that big, as that black thing is. Could be talking about a whole scroll. That takes another whole process to open. But once a fragment is identified, it's placed on a piece of glass and photographed. Each is assigned a Q number, the Q meaning Qumran, so that archaeologists, historians, theologians can find something according to number. The number identifies the cave from which it came. I'll show an example here in a minute. Then it's given a number to show its location. When did they find it? Where did they find it? So you might end up with something like 4Q. That would be cave number 4 of the Qumran community, 235 pieces that they've discovered. Various additions are made to those numbers, so you might end up with 4QS for the Serach, meaning Hebrew word for order, or you could end up with 4Q235, fragment number 4 through 6, column 1. That's how in depth you can get when you're studying these things. Whoops, let's go back. There you see some of the larger caves. I don't know which ones are caves 1 through 11. There are many caves over there within a 5-mile radius of the Qumran community. By many, I'm talking 50 to 100. They've all been looked into. There are 3 Jewish schools of philosophy as to how you approach your faith. And the first one we would look at would be the Pharisees. Jesus runs into the Pharisees every now and then, doesn't he? The Pharisees believed in the resurrection. They were mostly lay people, the Pharisees. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. And that's why at the end, when Jesus is crucified, they talk about those two getting together. It's really, really strange, really different. Sadducees was mostly a priestly group. Now, when we say priestly group, that's more than just a couple pastors in a church somewhere. The priests of that day numbered in the hundreds, And a family would be assigned a month. This is your month. Now you pick out 30 of your people that are going to be priests, and one of them will become the high priest that month. Then they might go to another family and they'd assign another month. I'm not going to get into the calendar problems. There are calendar problems galore at that point. But then the Essenes. The Essenes believed in a separation of body and soul. Now that's maybe a little oversimplified, but not much. I'm just trying to show the big difference between those 3 schools of thought that are up there. Okay, we're going to look at the remains of some of the community. Were the Essenes more priestly or lay people? They were more lay people, and we'll talk about the teacher of righteousness in a minute. Most feel that the Qumran site was a central headquarters of the Essene movement and the main dwelling place of the teacher and his disciples. Now, when you'll see in a minute what the site looks like, and you're going to say, how did hundreds of followers stay there? And most scholars agree that there probably could be a tent meeting, that maybe the remains of what you will see could probably house between 50 and 90 people at most, and that'd be back to back. But there would be hundreds maybe camping around. And the reason they began to look at why there must have been a lot more people around is that there is a Qumran cemetery. And taking the number of people in the Qumran cemetery over 100 years or so and saying, wow, there must have been a lot of people around. So it's thought that they camped nearby. The development of the central headquarters probably happened after their rejection by Pharisees and Sadducees. Might have been a small splinter group, might have been a little household Bible study of some sort that got together that considered themselves, they didn't call themselves Essenes, considered themselves special. Okay, what's their nature? They ate together, they studied together, and they worshiped together. And most importantly, they shared property together. That's what brought in their finances. Those are all listed in the Manual of Discipline of the Qumran community. Like the Essenes, the Christians of Acts chapter 2 through 4 practiced a community of goods, gathering everybody's wealth together to allow the church to grow. So that's, again, a similarity between Christianity and the Essene community. Thus, they were the Christians and Essenes were the only two Jewish groups known to have done that. I have it up there somewhere else, and I forget where, but it fits here, that you are more Jewish than you ever thought by being Christian. Okay, who's the leader of this group? They refer to the teacher of righteousness. Apparently was the founder of the Essenes and the leader of the Essenes. And it was a position that if the leader died, the next one took over. Was a priest exceptionally gifted in religious insight, one who believed to have been granted some special revelation from God about the true meaning of Scripture and the proper interpretation of the law of Moses. He had, as most religions do, we have the devil, evil, Satan, whatever you want to call him. He was opposed by the man of the lie. The man of the lie, again, was an individual who tried to dissuade many from submitting to the teacher's ideas. We find that as we read through the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here is the Qumran community from up high, just to give you an aerial view. There are some very unique things in there, and I'm going to point those out in just a minute. But that gives you they didn't have that during the time of the Qumran. Here is how it looks from up a little higher, but not an aerial view. We're going to look at a couple of the rooms. Well, this is, who knows what this would be called? A mikveh. It's the bath, a Jewish bath. And they found several of these within the community of the Qumran. Here's another one. It's a different one. Ritualistic bath, to cleanse yourself from your sin, to be able to worship, were a part of their religion, their faith. Even to the point they were far enough advanced that they created their own sewer system. And there's lots of pictures that go with this one that show how the sewer system was created to take all the sewage away from the community. Here's some of the coins that were found. You notice they're pretty round. Here's a great find. This was the find that really set the world on its ear as far as scholars were concerned, to be able to discover the pantry, the kitchen pantry. And when you total these items up, they figured there are enough bowls there to feed 200 people. Enough bowls to feed 200 people. There are also cups in there as well. But that's how it was found, looking just like that. And of course, this is an archaeologist bar at that point. And the best I can figure is this is a foot, 6 inches each. But then again, it might have been in meters. And so my mind doesn't work in meters very often. Okay. Here is an outline of the community, and there's some unique things that go on here. There's a large court, there's a kitchen up here, the library is over here, the assembly hall is down below, and the pantry is kept over here. And most feel that that was to keep the food away from any kind of bad water that flowed through there at that point. You'll see each of these is a cistern that I'm pointing to now. This was discovered a little later, but this crack came through in an earthquake in 31 BC, and so that's why it's thought it's there. Courtyard, did they play games? I don't know if they had a baseball team or not. But there's the court and the library. I'm going to show you in a minute how extensive this community had developed. This is a large assembly room. Another large assembly room. Possibly, this one is thought that possibly they ate there. It's very close to the pantry that was found. And I might add, I'll bring in the library later, these are 3 ink wells. No scrolls were found in the community when it was unearthed. Not a single one. They were all in caves. But all of a sudden, the science tells us as we study, these are ink pots. And here you can see the size, maybe 2 inches across, maybe 3 inches across. One of those is metal. I think it's the one in the middle, and 2 of them are pottery. So let's talk about who discovered the scrolls. We're going to go back and pick up a lot of the things that I already talked about. But 3 Bedouin cousins were grazing their sheep. Let's go with the major theory. One was kind of bored, and he was out there throwing rocks up at the holes that were in the hills. And one went inside, he scored an ace, and it went right in the hole, and he heard pottery break. But he did not go to investigate until the next day after he had shared that with his cousins. They sold them to an antique dealer who sold the original 4 and 3 in 2 different lots. Already here at the beginning, they're getting divided up. They found in that cave 8 jars. 6 were empty. 1 had dirt in it at the bottom, and the other contained 2 scrolls, later identified as the book of Isaiah and the manual of discipline. That was what they originally saw. They later returned and found 5 more. These are 2 of the 3 cousins. And one of my poor moments, I said to myself, how could we have a picture that good of someone who lived 2,100 years ago? These were the guys who found them, 1946 and 47. And then there's another fellow who comes into play here, Kando, who's a wholesaler in antiquities in Jerusalem. And he, in turn, sold 4 of the 7 to a Syrian Orthodox metropolitan. That's like, in the Orthodox Church, a metropolitan is like a bishop. And so he sold 4 of them to that Syrian Orthodox metropolitan. He sold 3 to Eleazar Sukenek, who was a professor at Hebrew University. He becomes very important. The Orthodox metropolitan decided he would see what he could get for the 4 that he had. He took out an ad in the New York Times. I'll show you that ad in a minute. And sold the 4 that were advertised to a man named Yadim. Yadim was a son-in-law of Sukenek. And so now the 7 were brought back into one individual's hands. This is the metropolitan. That's Kando. There's your ad in the New York Times. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. It'd be an ideal gift for an educational or religious institution by an individual or by a group, and gives you a P.O. box to write to, and that's where Yadin went and was able to buy them and give them back to his father-in-law. Very interesting that all of a sudden New York gets involved in this thing, but that's what happened to the first 7 scrolls that we have. Now, what did the scrolls look like? That's a question a lot of people have today. 10 jars, out of 11 caves, 10 jars were found that were at least 2 feet high, that looked like that's where you would put a scroll or scrolls. Now, there were over 17,000 scraps that were discovered on some of the cave floors, most of them in cave number 4. Portions of nearly 1,000 manuscripts. Now think about it. We just gave you 17,000 scraps, and you'd put them into 1,000 manuscripts. I'm married to someone who likes to put puzzles together, and everything gets cleared off the table when she's working, and stay out of the way. I'll tell you, on our way up to the cottage in Upper Michigan for the wedding, we stopped at her sister's, and her sister had this big 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle there on the table, and she said, I've been at this for 2 months. She sat down and in 2 days had it all put together. Now, they're written on parchment or papyrus, and one's copper scroll, believed to contain directions, they think now, to where the temple riches were hidden from the Romans. Where did they hide the temple riches, all the jewels in it? So it's thought that copper scroll may contain that. And as I said, they have been able, through infrared and archaeology, just increased in its importance as it's refined itself, that they can see through one layer to another layer. The other value of infrared, for instance, on papyrus or on parchment, would be something's written on there, but you can't quite see it because it's so dim. But under infrared light, you can bring it right out. And that's when they would probably take a photograph of that. Here's a couple of the jars that were found. Here's what an unrolled scroll could look like. Not many turn out this way, but a few do. I don't know which one this is. I'm going to show you various scrolls. Here you can see this scroll, how it fits together, but it's got openings. As I said before, class, the openings can come from animals, from rats, someone who was up there inhabiting these caves. I don't know if they had bats in their caves or not, but that's how they began to put them together to make it look like a scroll. We'll show you the science behind that in a minute. Here's another piece. All the bottom has been eaten away or rotted away, although the humidity there lended itself not to rotting. There you see one with the top rotted away. This is the metallic copper scroll. I don't think it's a good picture because you don't usually see that white on there, but they've been able to just not peel off yet, but take pictures, and they have started to think about peeling it away, because you can imagine how they get peeled away. Okay, we start asking how many are there and where are they located today. The Bedouin found 7 altogether initially. Then when they realized that the Orthodox priest received $250,000 from Yadim in order to give them back to Sukenek, they thought, hey, we're onto something here that make us more money than raising sheep. And so they went looking, and they found the majority of the scrolls, or the majority of the caves where the scrolls were found. There was also a French theologian who got his nose in there somewhere. The first 3, the book of Isaiah, the Manual of Discipline, and a commentary on the prophecy of Habakkuk. The next 4 were a collection of Psalms, another partial copy of Isaiah, the War Scroll, and the Genesis Apocryphon. The Apocryphons are stories that are based upon some of the narratives that are found in the Bible. And so if it's a Genesis Apocryphon, it can be a takeoff on what Abraham did after he left the Ur of the Chaldees and went down. It's a story, but it becomes an interpretive story for us today. Okay, here's, people ask, how are they authenticated? Great professors became involved, and they identify them and their value and began to announce their finds to the world, maybe using an example or 2, but they did not publish them. Archaeological dating of the scrolls takes place through a variety of means here. Coins, as I pointed out, 66, 67, 68, and history. What kings do some of these other scrolls talk about? Who are the leaders that they refer to? That puts it into a historical context. Handwriting comparison. Handwriting comparison becomes a big factor in piecing the pieces together. Carbon-14. Carbon-14 has been used a long time. It's found itself less used today than had been because of DNA. But, you know, there's so many atoms of carbon in the air, and over time they gradually decrease, and so you date something on the amount of carbon that is inside. It has to be soft material. It will not, it can be parchment to some extent, but definitely our papyrus to some extent, parchment really a lot. But now DNA is used. And infrared study. How do you think DNA is used to identify scrolls? What? Dating of the animal skins, which are parchment. The parchment are animal skins. And like all of us here, all of us have different DNAs. No two are alike. And the same is true of animals. And so as a result of that, they're able to take two pieces and say, do these belong together? And do a DNA study of each one. And if they are the same, they can begin piecing the pieces of the puzzle together. Here's what it looks like laid out after they began to find more and more. This is the Rockefeller Museum in Israel, and you can see how the pieces are laid out. They have either through handwriting or at that time through carbon-14 or by the shape of the pieces, they could begin putting them out on the tables and trying to figure out what goes with what. So there you get an idea of what one scroll could look like. And you see a lot of empty spaces. So the scholars have to fill that in with their knowledge and with their knowledge of Hebrew as well. Scrolls that are written in Hebrew and Aramaic, of course, go from right to left, top to bottom. So if you were, let's just say you got found a brand new scroll here, and you open it up, you'd read it right to left from top to bottom. But that didn't happen that way over there. There's some more pieces. That's still Hebrew. There's a part of the copper scroll that here is where they're looking in to try to see what's inside of that that tells them anything about history and about the war. Here are the biblical scrolls that you will find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, they're not all complete, but most of them are pretty good. Genesis, there are 20, possibly 21 scrolls. Come down to Deuteronomy. There are 30 scrolls that contain parts of Deuteronomy. Now, the way that would work is that I have nothing up here on the board. I'm just going to read you from my book, my scroll, and you're going to write it as you go. That's what those inkwells were for. You will write it, and that's why we come up with a lot of different versions of the various books. But Deuteronomy is very important. Isaiah is very important, as well as the Psalms, 34 different scrolls of the Psalms. Esther, 0. Daniel, 8, and then they put 1st, 2nd Chronicles last. Comes out to 206 copies of of the scrolls. Okay, how's the picture back there? Can you see that okay? Okay. This would be one of the gathering places, a place where they have, quote, an altar in the middle right now, but it wasn't necessarily always there. This is the scriptorium. I'm going to tell you why they know this was the scriptorium, where the scholars would sit around the edge. In the museum over there at the Israel Antiquities Authority, they have a makeshift, they're modern desks that they think it looks like where the scholars knelt and wrote on these desks, and that they would line up around the outside and the leader would be down here, so that they all had their own translation. This is why we think it's the scriptorium. There's a large hole, and if you look back here at the back end of that, you see the shape of the whole dark spot. It's the same here, and in the middle there's one cylinder hole, and that cylinder hole is probably big enough around for a scroll to fit through. Remember when you were in school and you went to the library to get something, you had to have help, or you had to check it out right away with the librarian, whatever. Well, if you were there in the scriptorium and you wanted a certain book, you could ask for it and it would be handed to you through that hole. And then there was a guard to keep you from taking it out, so you'd have to put it back in through that hole to keep the scroll intact. There's one corner of Qumran, which is a fortress. Of course, it didn't have wooden steps in those days, but this was a fortress from which they defended themselves from the Romans. Okay. The Dead Sea Scrolls hit a publication scandal. Not if there wasn't enough scandal already. What? You have a question?
No, there's a typo up there.
A typo, publications. Scandal is wrong? You edited my book, so I almost didn't publish it. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 or very late 46, came under the auspices of the Jordanian Antiquities Association. Remember, Israel didn't exist yet till the next year. When Israel came into being, they were transferred from the Jordanian Antiquities Association to the Israeli Antiquities Authority, IAA. It took a team of their own at IAA, their own appointed scholars. It took them 20 years to publish the first manuscript of one of those, 20 years. You imagine what it is, sorting out 17,000 pieces, but they weren't in any hurry. They knew what they were sitting on. It then took an enlarged team another 20 years to publish just 33 more of the manuscripts. Now, if they're over 900, think how long that would have taken. So in 1991, Herschel Shanks, who was the publisher of the BAR, Biblical Archaeology Review. There are thousands of us who belong to the Biblical Archaeological Society, and in our membership we get a monthly magazine called BAR. But he, together with two others, threatened a lawsuit against those at the Israeli Antiquities Authority before they became public. They lost in court. The guy they went up against proved that his were the authentic scrolls and that they belonged to him, and they didn't belong to anybody else. Shanks was a real leader in wanting to get those published. Naturally, Biblical Archaeological Review. But he was given a fine. I don't know what the translation of the dollars were, but it was lessened when they repealed, lessened by quite a bit. And the scrolls, though, because the guy had to show that he was the actual owner of them, and all of them now became public. So where are the scrolls today? Almost all the real scrolls are in Jerusalem. A few are in Jordan, in Europe, maybe at Oxford, in England, and in the USA. How many have seen a display of the scrolls somewhere? Michael, you've seen them over in Jerusalem. They were at Duke University somewhere about a year or two ago. There are various groups of scrolls that kind of travel around. I saw some of the first ones in 1965, but that's when they only let a few out, and that was it. And they came from Israel. They were in the Washington Art Gallery. Few that are in the Shrine of the Book. I'm going to show you a picture of the Shrine of the Book in a moment. In Jerusalem, those few are accessible to everyone. The majority are stored on campus of the Israel Museum in a small temperature and humidity controlled vault, as you would guess. However, any scholar can get permission today to see them if they are preparing something for publication or to re-photograph them. But you have to have signed, sealed, and delivered from somebody. Okay, numerous microfiche and complete photographic copies can be found in 4 places. The Huntington Library in San Marino, California. One very wealthy lady gave a lot of money for them to accumulate what they could photographically. The Ancient Biblical Manuscript Center in Claremont, California, which there's a great theological school there. Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. Hebrew Union is really looked to as an authority of the Hebrew language among Americans. And then the Oxford Center for Postgraduate Hebrew Studies. That's where the 4 complete photographic copies are now found, in addition to, of course, the originals. This is the museum, the Shrine of the Book. I forgot the name of it all right. That's what the Shrine of the Book looks like. Inside, here you see it's natural light. They don't want other light. You don't go in there and start flashing your camera on there. But it's in the round, and this doesn't show my politics, simply shows you a size of what they are in the round. So where does Jesus fit into all of this? John the Baptist was probably an Essene. Whether or not he was an Essene of the Qumran community, we don't know. We have no idea. Essenes gave up any earthly wealth, and they lived in poverty and in community. They shared food, they shared everything. 13%, or about 120 texts, are in the Aramaic language. Why? Why would they be in the Aramaic language? If Israel was taken captive, or Judah, Israel went 732 or something like that, but Judah was taken captive and over to Babylonia. And in Babylonia, they would speak Aramaic. And that was in 534 or 5, somewhere around there, BC, hundreds of years before, but that would carry on. Also, those who were under the authority of what was being said in Babylonia would have to go to court, and naturally the courts were not in Hebrew, the courts were in Aramaic. And so the people who came back to Judah, they probably spoke Aramaic, and Hebrew then becomes the language of worship as opposed to the language of everyday life. I know I'm old enough that when I was sent to my grandparents on a Sunday night, if my parents were going to go play pinochle somewhere with somebody else, they dropped me off my grandmother's, I'd have to go to church with my grandmother and grandfather, and it was in German. And I didn't understand a single word of it. But when we got back to the house, they spoke to me in English. I didn't see that they even had any kind of a twang or anything that made a difference. That would be somewhat the same way as what occurred. These also seem to be, some of those, remember I said precede the finding, they would be set in time of the exile. Also, you have to ask the question, did Abraham speak Hebrew? He came from way up in the Ur of the Chaldees. Hebrew was not a spoken language up there. It also would have been odd to speak Hebrew in the exile courts. Early Jewish apocalyptic literature, now you all understand apocalyptic, it's a study of the future. They're often inscribed in Aramaic. So the scrolls that have been found, Daniel and Jubilees, are in Aramaic. Writing in Aramaic then made the text available to communities beyond Judea, including the Jews of the diaspora up across Asia Minor. I don't even know what I have here next. Okay, the big question that we have to face, was Jesus influenced by the Essenes? There seems to be substantial overlap between the people of the scrolls and the early Christians in their way of life and beliefs. You find the earliest followers of Jesus and the literature they produced were very Jewish in nature. Both the scrolls, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself, both the scrolls as well as the Bible, especially the Gospel of John, talks about light and dark, gives you all these opposites. That's what you find throughout the scrolls. They're the most significant body of Hebrew Aramaic literature related to a Jewish group from roughly this time. A fairly large amount of the scrolls was known and had been applied to New Testament study before 1947. It was not that they'd found the scrolls or they were giving thought to the scrolls. It was just the evolution of the Christian faith still lined up very much with what the Essenes were teaching. Okay, two parallels between the scrolls and the New Testament will illustrate this point. First of all, the ongoing nature of divine revelation. The age of revelation had not ended with the last book of the Old Testament, but continued up until their times. You are probably more Jewish than you thought. Members of both communities read Scripture eschatologically, in the sense that they pointed forward. So, take John, for instance. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. That's eschatology, just the evolution of something about the Savior or about the end. Both groups, Essenes and Christians, anticipated messianic leadership at the end of time. However, their views about a Messiah or Messiahs differed. The Essenes saw multiple Messiahs. Okay. In the Qumran text, the Festival of Weeks was probably the occasion for an annual covenant renewal of all those who were part of the Essene community. And new members were then received into the group. They had to go through a year of study and everything else. But now, in the Christian church, you have Pentecost. And how many of you were confirmed on Pentecost? I think if you look back, many of you, if you have a Lutheran background, were confirmed on Pentecost. Here's another parallel. The three books which appear on, to me, this is the biggie. The three books which appear on the largest number of Qumran texts are also the three most quoted books in the New Testament. Anybody want to guess what they are? What? Isaiah's one. Psalms is one. Deuteronomy. Remember, we had a lot of law of discipline there. So there are the three that occur most often. And if you look back into the Gospels, you'll find that Jesus also quotes those more than anything else in the Old Testament. Okay, so we're left with these questions. How well did Jesus know John the Baptist? And everybody said, oh, he was his cousin, right away. Well, yeah, maybe they were cousins. But Jesus was up in Nazareth, and he came down about 70 miles to be baptized by John in the Jordan River. Now, were they cousins? Yeah, they were, but doesn't say anything about Jesus ever following John the Baptist. He was upset when John the Baptist was beheaded, but how well he really knew him and what his faith was, he went there for a baptism for the remission of sins, the same as we have today. Had John the Baptist ever been to Qumran? If John the Baptist was part of an Essene group, not necessarily Qumran, did he influence Jesus' lifestyle and his teaching? Is the evidence of common thought and lifestyle enough to say Jesus was influenced by the Dead Sea Scrolls? Now, after saying that, remember Jesus was both human and divine. And we would think through his divinity he could decipher what was what. So those are the questions that we're left with at the end. I'm going to open it up here for questions. Just a reminder that next week we'll talk about eternal life, which is a study of the final chapters of the book of Revelation. And there'll be, so bring your Bibles if you're planning to come, and we'll have fun with it. If you want to know what goes into the early chapters, I still have some books down there that I wrote, 19 years ago. Wow, it's hard to believe that. So, anybody have any questions that came out of this? Yes, dear.
Well, I know that there is a huge black market for antiquities, especially from the Middle East. How much would that have possibly played into the result of the fragments, maybe missing scrolls altogether that somebody else in the world has claimed to be from the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Okay. Start out here. They're still looking. There's scholars still looking, searching in the caves. Number two, we think, most of us, that they found the majority, the vast majority, but they might find a scrap. Now, whoever finds that scrap has to prove its authenticity and its year and so forth, either through DNA or depending on what it's on, to be able to get anything from it. Now, the fact that there are 17,000 scraps just in Cave 4, not to count the other caves, you would say that you find a scrap, it's not worth a whole lot. And yes, there is a market for antiquities, and find them over and over again. If you deal in anything archaeological, it's interesting, but don't go out looking today. But there could be more caves. There are more people still looking, but they're not finding much. Any other questions? Yeah, Frank.
Just one technical point. You said that
Wait. Gotta get you on TV.
you said that the ad was in the New York Times, but at the bottom of the ad it said right to the Wall Street Journal. So it was probably in the
I'm
Journal.
sorry. I meant the Wall Street Journal. I appreciate that. Yep. Anything else? Okay, I think, just want to say a couple words. They cleaned my office out today. I don't know why, but they did. If anyone wants copies of the 5 sessions I did on Revelation a couple of years ago, they're here. If you're interested in what Lutherans believe and teach, Pastor Mark gives those out to new members. This is Jim Moore wrote this book. Lest, Lord, I have sinned, but I have several excellent excuses. So that's a good one too. The only other one is if you want to read all the way up, this is a book that I wrote 19 years ago, A Reader's Guide to the Book of Revelation. You can still get it on Amazon, yeah. You can get it cheaper from me, but you can still get it on Amazon. Michael?
I have a question for you. Did
Yeah.
Jesus ever, somewhere when I was in Qumran, our guide explained that when they went on a sabbatical kind of thing, they shaved their beard and they shaved their head. Did Jesus ever, on his travels, somewhere I thought I read where he did shave his head in one of the books?
No, I don't remember that anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything else? Thank you all for coming tonight. Go in peace and serve. If you are interested in knowing what are in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the translation of the Dead Sea